thought you had your own.
much. No, I don't have my own. I keep things very simple here. Good morning, Nevada County. I'm so happy to be here. I went to a bar in downtown Nevada City last night where the geezers were playing. And man, this place must be the fountain of youth, because I have never seen so many baby boomers just dancing up a storm. Were any of you there? Okay, a couple of you, yeah. Clearly a place where it must be the farming here, but it was really, really fun. People wonder why I do this work, and the real reason is because my colleagues go to conferences and they are supported by funders like Pfizer and Merck and so on. But I get to be supported by moo trails, you know? So, as you just heard, I do still spend a fair amount of my week in this room seeing patients. Definitely not a farm environment, pretty sterile except for the art on the walls. And I am a family physician, see people throughout the lifespan. But more and more over the past decade, I have been really preoccupied by dirty thoughts. Mostly concerning soil, and trying to understand how it is that the health of my patients that I see in this room are connected back to the soil. And so early on, when I started to do this investigation to really understand these links, I went to the medical literature because that's when I knew what to do. So I actually went to PubMed, which is one of the premier medical research engines, and I put in the words soil health and human health to see what came up. Well, this is where all the top hits were. Radon, heavy metals, pesticides, pathogenic yeast, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, tetanus. Definitely does not sound like a healthy place, not a place where you would want to spend time or have your children play, or certainly not eat from. And I said, this just does not make sense intuitively from what I know. And so I decided I'd go to the agricultural literature and put in those same words. And these are the words that started to come up. Carbon sequestration, nitrogen cycling, nutrient cycling, water filtration, crop yield. Well, this sounded a little more promising to me, but I really had no idea what any of this meant. And I certainly wasn't sure how it related back to my patients. So, being a hands-on learner, because that really is what you do in medicine, you do rotations and clinical experiences and so on, I decided I needed to go out and learn from a new kind of teacher. And so I started to do internships. But these were internships on farms that I actually had identified as being healthy, sustainable, these words that regenerative, words that we associate with some kind of health giving. And really to try and learn about the deep connections between the health of our cells and our bodies and the health of the soil. And what I discovered, and I'm going to give you the punchline right now, and you can just leave, is just that, in fact, we are deeply integrated into the soil, and it is in fact it's a mega organ. It's really an accessory to our own body. And let me give you some examples in the next hour. The first example would be that soil is in fact our digestive system of sorts, or at least an accessory digestive system. And I have learned this over the years with many farmers. But most recently, I had the pleasure of learning it from these two people. Do you recognize them? Yeah. So I know you've heard a lot about the Kaiser Farm just now, but couldn't you have sat there for another hour and heard a whole bunch more, right? Okay. So I actually spent a morning with Paul and Elizabeth last week on singing frogs. And it is, I can tell you, I don't know how many of you have physically been to their farm, but you should all go. I saw it in the dead of winter in the part where, they are having to use some of those tarps to cover, but it still is a magical place. But for me, what was even more magical was actually their story. And they shared this in part with you, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a different perspective, and I hope you don't mind, Paul and Elizabeth, but this is actually a remnant of their old farm. What they started off with when they were envisioning what they wanted to do. These are raised beds, presumably with a lot of imported soil. And what happened is as they began to understand the needs of their land and the nature of their place, they realized that in fact, these raised beds were kind of like a colostomy bag onto their body. They were not integrated into their digestive system. They were kind of like this thing that was separate. And the way that they figured this out, I'm sorry, as a doctor, you're going to just hear all these medical analogies. I'm one of those people that unfortunately talks about bodily function at dinner parties, and everybody leaves the room, So what Paul and Elizabeth suggested is that, in fact, there was a little bit of a disconnect happening for them because Elizabeth came from healthcare and had that deep knowledge, and Paul came from ecology and agroforestry. So what they were doing is kind of doing these raised beds and then pouring their love and attention into these riparian ways, these hedgerows, because that is in fact what Paul knew how to do, was to make these really rich ecosystems that in his mind perhaps didn't have so much to do with agriculture, and this is how he explained it to me. But the aha moment for him was realizing that there was so much life and so much carbon happening in these ecosystems. And when you look at this map of where we have the most productive lands on this planet, and also by along in tandem with that, the most carbon-rich places, you see that swamps, marshes, and all of those, which is essentially what they created in their riparian ways, that those are some of the most biologically diverse, productive, carbon-rich ecosystems. And what he explained to me was he suddenly realized I needed to bring that into the farm. So he started to create the same kind of richness in the food production. And the way he did that was just applying everything he knew from agroforestry and basically farming in the image of nature, with keeping the ground covered and conserving water and having a variety of seeds and cycling all the nutrients. And they don't necessarily have macro animals on their farm, but what I learned is they have tons of micro animals. And the most interesting thing also is in terms of cycling their nutrients, they have these amazing composts, but they also really look at their entire community as an extension of their farm. So they take nutrients from the compost in the community, and that makes it back into the farm, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because they're exporting nutrients to their community. So that's part of the cycle. So that is, in fact, what has given them this incredibly rich and vibrant farm. But when I was talking to Elizabeth, she said, what I really am in the business of doing is exporting nutrients. And that made a lot of sense to me, and certainly is a way that we get healthy from their farm. But you kind of sit there and you think, what is the link between the Kaiser Singing Frogs farm and our health? What are the connections there? Well, First of all, it's the richness of the soil itself. And you've heard the story about how they're building and protecting this soil. And when you actually look, and this is a study that was done in Science magazine, the ground that you see on the right is sort of an example of what the Kaisers have made in terms of what is going on there, versus on the left is what you would see in a more conventional system. What do you see? What are the differences if you looked here, even if you've never farmed a day in your life? Diversity. Yell out some other things. Color, abundance. How about the soil itself? Someone said more cracks, right? Is it? Yeah, I mean, if this were your skin, which one would you rather have in a way? The one on the left looks like it's been denuded, like, you know, you're going to develop a bad rash soon. So what's happening under that soil on the one on the right is this. It's all the unpaid workers, the billions of microbes, the fungi, the bacteria, the worms, the more macro things like the voles. And when scientists actually compare that conventional system and compare a system like the Kaisers in terms of the diversity of microbes in the soil, this is what it shows. Everything above the blue line is a unique type of DNA that exists in a regenerative style of agriculture in the soil, and everything below that blue line is a unique type of DNA that exists in a conventional model. What do you see? You see that it's like an international city of microbes in the Kaiser system versus in a monocrop, which actually they're neighbors, and they didn't show you this picture. They got a monocrop conventional setup of a vineyard right next door. It probably looks like much more what's going on below the blue line. And this same researcher, John Reganold, who's really on the forefront of sort of measuring soil diversity and mapping it onto what happens to plants, has shown with that one study, and by the way, that was done in 2 different crops of strawberries in Watsonville, the diversity study I showed you. He's shown that, in fact, even in one growing season, the strawberries that are in that regenerative soil are producing 10% more of a lot of vital nutrients, okay? And with each growing season, that increases more and more. Now, when John Reganold started to do this research relating soil biodiversity to plant nutrients, he was one of the first. He was a total pioneer. Slowly, we're starting to get other researchers who are starting to look at this. Pedro Antunes published a whole book, or actually this was a chapter in a book, looking at how important different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi really are the most intense working horses when it comes to passing nutrition from the soil to the plant and then on to us. His chapter shows how, in fact, different varietals of plants work with specific kinds of fungi in kind of this interesting lock and key mechanism, and also with different kinds of bacteria to harvest more nutrients. So it's kind of like they work as a special team. And that started to make farmers much more savvy about, in fact, what kinds of micro-life they want in their soil to enrich the quality of their plants. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with a system called Korean natural farming, where they really have brought this to a science. David Johnson is a I think he's a molecular biologist, in fact, at New Mexico University. And he's starting to study how this sort of enhanced, biologically enhanced compost, which he calls BEAM, how when he puts that into a regenerative system, how in fact within the soil it gives him, you can see percent increase, way more of a whole bunch of different vital nutrients, and that in fact that gets passed on to the plants. So you can see how under soil life is in fact increasing the nutrients in the soil and increasing the nutrients in the plants, and that is what we benefit from. But there's other connections as well between the Kaiser Farm and our own digestive system and our own nutrition. If you go and you look at this crop that's going in, and Elizabeth did this beautiful job of telling you about how they get one thing out and they put another thing in, and I pointed to that row there and I said, Elizabeth, tell me the story of that row over the next 12 months, of just that one row. And she started to do that fabulous dance that she did on stage. And she said, I'm going to put in kale and strawberries, and then I'm going to put in leeks and bok choy, and then give me a romaine, and then give me a broccoli and a red butter lettuce. And sure, I'll throw in some tatsoi, right? And I started to jot this stuff down and think about it. And then I walked next to the row and saw everything that's growing outside the row, which are these volunteer weeds, but that are also incredibly edible, like the dandelion and the curly dock. And, and what's going on up there, Elizabeth, on the top there? Those are last season cauliflower, but that you're also going to harvest as well. Yeah. And then I walked a couple steps further, and there's some fennel and some other curly dock and all this stuff. And I started to think of the sheer diversity that is coming out of just one single row in a 12-month period. Now, going over to the nutrition side of things, nutritionists have been, tying themselves into pretzels, trying to figure out what is the best indicator of a nutrient-dense diet. Is it, measuring micronutrients? Is it cups of this and cups of that? All these things. And over again in the research, guess what the best indicator of a nutrient-rich diet is? Diversity. That same word, diversity. Eating your rainbow. Eating a whole bunch of colors, and so on. And this was one of the first studies that was done in 2006, linking dietary diversity to health. But since then, it's been done all over the globe. This is one in Ethiopia that's, with Malawi and Mauritania, and you can go through the nutrition research, and dietary diversity is probably the single best indicator. This is one in France that showed, and so on. So it turns out that simply by having that beautiful rotation throughout the year and all these different colors and all these different plants, Elizabeth and Paul are ensuring that they're nourishing themselves and nourishing their community. They don't have to get out there and do a lot of RDAs and nutrient counts and so on and so forth. They know they have a nutrient-dense farm. And in fact, this is a really interesting study that was done in the journal Appetite, because you know how we're always trying to get kids to eat more vegetables or adults to eat more vegetables? It turns out that that same diversity works in terms of stimulating appetite as well. So kids are much more likely to eat vegetables if they have the rainbow of colors rather than just the chard or just the beans or what have you. So it works not only in terms of improving our nutritional status, but it also works in helping us want to eat the stuff, to have the diversity. So there you go. What these wonderful farmers have created is really a very important, vital part of our digestive system. So I'm going to let you guys decide where you would want to get your nutrients from. Okay? So let's move on to soil as immune system. And I, once again, have learned this lesson from a number of very wonderful farmers. But it was really Cody Holmes on Rockin' H Ranch who was one of the first farmers that taught me this connection. And Cody was what one might call a conventional rancher. He, had 1,000 acres and lots of head of cattle, and he was, just using lots of inputs in order to keep his cattle going, doing the dewormers and the vaccines and so on, and the growth hormones, and he was also just going broke, buying all the feed that he needed to keep these cattle going. And by the way, he's in the Ozarks in Missouri. And he had to take work off the ranch in order to support his ranching habit. And he decided that, enough. And he read writings by folks like Jill Salatin, who's sitting here, and he also started to read the writings of folks who are doing more of the rotational grazing, Alan Savory and Andre Voisin and what have you. And he decided to convert his ranch to a holistic ranch where he had the cattle move around in these tight paddocks, much like the bison moved around the middle states when we still had bison in this country, where they were just intensively graze in one area, churn up the soil, deposit their nutrients back into the soil, and then move on to the next area. And so with just a bunch of electric wire, he created these paddocks on his farm. And all of a sudden, he stopped needing the inputs. He stopped needing all the vaccines. He stopped needing to buy the grains and so on. He started making money. And it was a transformational moment for him. But when I talked to Cody about this experience, he would tell me the most amazing part was that my cattle started getting really, really healthy. I stopped having all the calf deaths, and I stopped having all the chronic disease in my cattle, the digestive disease, the upper respiratory diseases that I had when I was in a conventional system. So I asked Cody, I said, well, what was the secret sauce there? And he said, he knelt down on the ground and he pointed downward and he said, it's the billions of unpaid creatures under this grass that are the ones that are doing the work and passing all of those benefits on to my cattle. And this made intuitively a lot of sense to me in some ways, but as a physician, I was a little confused about the connections there between those billions of bacteria and the health of his cattle. So I did some research and I ended up in this woman's office in Munich, Germany, because it turns out that she was one of the pioneer researchers on something called the farm effect, or trying to understand why is it that children who are raised on regenerative or sustainable farms have much less asthma and allergy, and now they're discovering fewer autoimmune diseases than children who are raised on conventional farms or children who are raised off farms in urban areas. And so I went and I met with Dr. von Mutius, and I said to her, Dr. von Mutius, tell me what's going on here? Why are these children so much healthier? And she went over to her computer and she clicked through the screens, and this is the photo that she brought up. And she said to me, Dr. Miller, this is the answer, okay? Wow, so what do you see here? A lot going on in this photo, right? How many of you is a scene that you would see on your farm or at your home? Actually, quite a few. Wonderful, wonderful. I always get fixated on the fact that the baby is secured in the bouncy seat, but the cows are not secured. But that's just the family doctor in me. So, so over on the left, you have your pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin D added chocolate milk, right? No. So raw milk that was collected that morning and will be fed to the other 6 kids in the family and probably thrown out by that evening if it's not, because you get it fresh the next day. If it's not all consumed. You have the mom in the background throwing hay in the air. And this is so confusing to me because what Dr. Van Mutius studies specifically is allergies, which we call hay fever. And yet this is what she's doing, is throwing hay in the air. You have manure, you have the cows. So Dr. Van Mutius did what any good researcher would do, because she really didn't know what the secret was here. What was protecting these kids from asthma and allergy and all these things? So she descended on these farms with swabs, big packets of swabs. And she swabbed everything. She swabbed the babies and the bouncy seats and the moms and the hay and the front ends and the back ends of the cows and the beds and so on. And then she went into an urban apartment in Munich where some of her patients who were suffering from asthma, and she swabbed everything there. And what do you think she found? It's that diversity word again. So the blue line in both of these sides, both for bacteria and for fungi, is on the y-axis measuring levels of diversity. And you can see that it's going up, 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 up for number of detectable bands. We don't have to go there. It's a little bit more confusing. Versus the flat line of the asthma kids, no diversity at all. So it's really the same thing that John Reginauld found in that strawberry patch in the soil. That, kind of in the conventional system, no diversity. And in these regenerative systems, lots of diversity. And by the way, within that diversity, because I know you guys had a food safety session here, there was tons of healthy things, the lactobacilli and so on. But there were also things like Campylobacter, Shigella, Salmonella, Listeria, words that make food safety inspectors cringe and want to shut you down, right? But these players, these, what we're going to call them evildoers, existed in a bouquet with many, many more of the healthy bacteria. And what they discovered is that probably a few of them are not so bad as long as the preponderance of the population is actually beneficial. Does that make sense? That it really is kind of the whole system rather than focusing on one unique evildoer. And this research now is being replicated around the world and is getting more and more sophisticated. The most recent study was published comparing the Amish to the Hutterite, because in fact, in general, Amish farmers have more of a regenerative model to their agriculture versus Hutterites work more in a conventional system. They're very similar populations from a genetic standpoint and from a cultural standpoint. So we know that those are, and they also, same rates of breastfeeding and other things that might be protective. But they're finding that the Amish kids have much lower rates of asthma and allergy. And it probably has, once again, to do with the farming system and that diversity of microbes. And expanding out to the global picture, when they measure biodiversity on this planet, which is forever shrinking, and this is through the Living Planet Index and the Waterfall Index, what we're seeing is that rates of all of these allergic and autoimmune diseases are increasing at a mirror rate. Can we prove that these two phenomena are causative? No, we cannot. But it is an amazing thing to see that both of these things are happening at the same time. So I'm going to let you decide how you want to deal with your immune system. The choice on the left or the choice on the right? So soil as nervous system. Now, there's no place that taught me this better than these two farms in Oklahoma. I'm sorry, in Arkansas. It's on the Oklahoma border, and I always forget that, but it's literally on the Oklahoma border. But this is Arkansas and Heartland Egg. Can you guys see where the two farms are here? It's hard to see the second farm. These are both owned by the Cox family, and it started off as the farm on the left. These are 5 hen houses with 15,000 layers per house. And both for financial and philosophical reasons, they have moved over to the farm on the right. This is what you see inside each one of these farms. By the way, do you know what the eggs from these farms are labeled when you buy them in the supermarket? What's the one on the left? Oh, you guys are good. Yeah. Yeah. So which of these hens, I want you to just pretend you were a hen for a moment. And this is just, we're just gonna imagine if you were a hen, where do you think you would be happier? The one on the right or the one on the left? The one on the right, you're saying, why? Open, sunshine, you actually can move, fresh air. You actually still have the tip of your beak, which you can't have on the left because it's too dangerous to leave them on because they would peck each other's cloaca to death, or peck each other to death by pecking their cloaca or something like that. Yeah, you also can make little pods of friends. You know, it's like when you live in a really huge city and there's so many people around, you actually can never find a friend. That's kind of what it's like on the left. Versus on the right, you have a little bit of space and can make these social networks. You also have you can fly a little bit up to a roost, and you actually have roosts. And you can get worms from the soil, and there's many things that would make us imagine that your henness would be a little bit more enriched by the one on the right, or a lot more enriched. But scientists are beginning to discover yet another reason why you might be happier in the situation on the right. And that is because of these guys. They're called Mycobacterium vacca, and believe it or not, they're relatives of the Mycobacterium that it causes tuberculosis. But these guys are incredibly benign, and they live in all kinds of healthy soil. I'm sure that Paul and Elizabeth have tons of vacca in their soil. And what we're discovering is that these guys might have kind of a special relationship with our nervous system, possibly by getting into our gut and stimulating the vagus nerve and having that transmitted as a message to our brain where serotonin is released and so on. But honestly, this is just doctor talk because no one really knows how it works. But what they discovered was that M. vacca actually seems to improve mood. And it was found in an incredibly serendipitous way. There was some early research that showed that M. vacca stimulated the immune system. So researchers used it in a study of patients who had end-stage lung cancer to see if it extended their life a little bit more. And what they found out was that it did not. It had no benefit there. But in the study group that received the M. vacca, they were reporting these sort of off-the-chart happiness scores, or, you know, that they were way less depressed than the group that hadn't received M. vacca. But that got them very curious, and so they started to do research on it and its effect on mood, and found that, in fact, it has a very positive effect on mood. So for me, when I learned about M. vacca, the thing that got me the most excited, going back to that egg story and the model from the farms, was this. That, in fact, when you actually study the quality, the nutrient quality of the eggs from that healthy system versus from the high density conventional system, you find out that the pastured eggs have way more of a lot of vital nutrients. And that the free range organic eggs kind of look just like conventional. There's really no difference in the nutrient quality, which makes sense, right? When you see the pictures. And you guys know that intuitively, right? Because when you go and crack an egg that you've just grown in your backyard in a beautiful system, you have to hit it really hard, right? To get it to break. Because that's all the rich calcium in that egg. And that's just a marker for all the other nutrients that are there. But the reason I really love this antidepressant story is because when you look at these nutrients in particular, and then map them back to the nutrients that we need in order for our nervous system to function well, it turns out that they're actually a lot of the same ones. So this is what makes me realize that what's good for the pasture is good for the egg, is good for the hen, is good for the farmer, is good for the consumer, is good for the pasture, and so on and so forth. We're all working in this beautiful system together. And that is one of the things that I love the most about these complex regenerative models, is that it all marches together. The final example I'm going to give is soil as a respiratory system. Now, this picture, guess where this was taken? My dad took this picture during the fires this fall. But these are not the fires. He was in Davis, California. He lives in Village Homes, which is just right outside of Davis. And he walked across the street from his house to an organic setup and took this picture. And I don't need to tell you what this does to a farmer's lungs, or to your lungs if you live nearby, are not even that close. And let's forget the loss of nutrients and all of those other things that Paul and Elizabeth were talking about. Just think of all of those particles embedded in your bronchus, in your alveoli. Or look at these two systems that we already saw. Guess what happens to all of the methane and the CO2 and the nitrous oxide that Paul was mentioning? In the pastured system, it goes down into the soil. In this other system, it goes up. Do you know what one of the most dangerous jobs in the world is? Working in a high density, any kind of animal system, but a high density hen house. The worst disability, the worst chronic obstructive lung disease. How can we think that it can injure the workers so terribly and that it's not injuring us? So let's flip to a happy story. And this is in the Bronx. And Karen Washington is really, she's one of the heroes of the urban regenerative farming movement. Karen was living across the street from a place that looked like that. And she decided she had enough, and she converted it to the thing on the right. I'm sorry, these two slides are so... But she didn't stop there. Because I don't know if anybody here knows Karen Washington, but oh, you know, she does not stop. She now is actually running a farm in upstate and bringing all her food into the Bronx. But she didn't stop there. She started to make community gardens all over the mid-Bronx, and each one of these spots indicates it. Now, if you look at this photo, it's very exciting that you see all these gardens, especially because there actually are no healthy grocery stores anywhere on this section of the map. And so what Karen has done is absolutely amazing. But there's some things that, as powerful as Karen is, she can't change, and that is where the Bronx is located. It is strangled by freeways, by industry, and so on. Just toxic, it's, located in this toxic zone. And when you look at the rates of asthma in all the boroughs of New York City, guess who wins the Olympic prize here? It is the Bronx. These are actually asthma emergency department visits for little kids, ages 0 to 4, when their lungs are the most vulnerable. The Bronx. So, what do we know about asthma? There's one thing that we know that is actually quite hopeful, and that is that kids who are living in areas that have lots of greenery, and by the way, trees are just, mega green, but any kind of greenery, have lower rates of asthma that seems to be directly related to, regardless of socioeconomic level, regardless of genetics and so on, seems to be related to greenery. And in fact, there seems to be a very clear dose response, where for every 1.5 trees within an acre area, you see this decreased rate of asthma. By the way, my partner is a statistician, and I can see his eyebrows going up there in the second row. He hasn't seen this study yet. He's not sure if he believes it, but it is. So it really does seem like this greenery effect actually has a direct benefit on our lungs that looks really something like this. So back to Karen, what is she doing? She has taken this place with unbelievably high asthma rates and created an oasis of greenery everywhere. The most exciting thing she did in this realm was because she had built all these little, gardens, which really became a virtual farm. It's called La Familia Verde. They needed to have a farmer's market to sell their produce. And so they set up a farmer's market in front of Tremont Park, which at that point was an abandoned, pretty barren park where nobody liked to go because it had high crime rates and nobody was policing it, and it felt like a very unsafe place. But because the farmer's market was there, the public schools started to take their lunch break and come to the farmer's market. And to encourage them, Karen started giving all the kids a free apple. Now, if you're a little elementary school kid and someone gives you a free apple, what do you need to do to eat that apple? You got to go sit somewhere, right? So they started to go into this dangerous park that the community wasn't using. And all of a sudden, everybody in the community started to pay attention. And they started to police the park, and they started to do things to amend the park. And next thing you know, they floated a bond for a little bit over $4 million and completely redid the park. And all those protective trees, they came in. All of that asthma protection. And this is a photo from a year and a half ago. They now have health fairs in the park. So what Karen did by starting these community farms, basically, was bring in a whole new respiratory system and a whole new health system into the mid-Bronx. This unbelievable connection that happens between changing the soil and changing the air and making healthier people. So, how do you build your community from the soil up? First of all, I gotta tell you guys, you're already doing it here. You have Sierra Harvest, which is light years ahead. So as ambassadors, when you become ambassadors for Sierra Harvest, my hope is that you move outside of this area and start to bring this knowledge to other places, because this entire country and this entire globe needs to become like what's happening here in this county. I'm just going to add a little piece before I give you some ideas for how to grow a healthy community. I need to add a little piece of autobiography here, just so you understand why I'm doing this. And I'm sorry, this is a departure at this moment, but I stuck the slide in here and I'm not going to move it around. So that little creature over on the right is me. And I don't think I need to tell you why I do this work once you see this picture. This is a farm in the act of being destroyed. And my parents were homesteaders. I've actually never showed. My parents were homesteaders in upstate New York. And it was a very strange childhood between this farm, and my dad actually was career Peace Corps. I grew up a lot overseas. But that's Mr. LePan, our neighbor. And I didn't understand tillage. I didn't understand herbicides. I didn't understand pesticides. But what I did understand is that our pond was covered with green algae every year from the runoff from the fertilizers, and I was told I couldn't swim in it. I did understand that Mr. LePan could no longer make a living on his farm, both because his soil became so depleted and because his dairy was bought out by, put out of business because, the big dairies had come into upstate New York. And in fact, his son Paul, who was supposed to inherit the farm, had to go off and work for the correctional system because that's the only way he could make a living. He could no longer work as a farmer. So what I saw was, as a child, was a community being destroyed. And that probably deeply worked its way into my psyche. I saw agriculture being hurting people and being unhealthy many times in my career. I worked in Natividad during my internship and saw the poisoning of conventional agriculture in terms of what it did to my patients, who I saw, having seizures from organophosphate poisoning and showing up in the ER. But really, in terms of this idea of a piece of land being an extension of our organ systems in our bodies, whenever you're deciding, is this the right thing to do to build my soil and build my community, I want you to give it the mega organ test. Is what's going on here something that I would say, is it the same way I would treat my own body, my own cells? And so for farms, we have an amazing example with the Kaisers, but I'm sure there's so many of you in this room that have healthy, beautiful farms that truly you are proud to say are an extension of my body, are as valuable to me as my lungs and my digestive system and so on. And I love this picture. This is a farmer in Colorado who's actually, he just decided to name his farm Nutrient Dense Farm. Why mince words? That's what we're really going for. And this is a whole community in Järna, Sweden, where they're doing regenerative agriculture. The entire community has bought into it, including the hospitals and the schools and so on. And it's just seamless throughout the whole community. I was invited there as a soil fellow for their Summer of Soil. And what's amazing about this community is that they actually have a soil museum. I really encourage you guys here to make your own soil museum. And part of starting to think of farms as an extension of your body is understanding that farming doesn't just happen on farms, it happens everywhere. This is downtown Nevada City. You guys are growing brassicas on the sidewalk. And by the way, I saw some weed growing on that sidewalk too. I don't know if that's just since legalization, but you have brothers and sisters doing this all over the globe. I was just in China a couple weeks ago, and this is tatsoi growing on the sidewalk in, downtown Wuhan, China. So we're doing this everywhere. We're bringing the people to the farms and the farms to the people and making these beautiful connections. That wonderful Sierra Harvest movie showed us how eco-literacy, or educating young kids, not only gives them STEM resources and teaches them math and so on, but can change their health and change their lives. I was in Northeast India for the Indigenous Terra Madre conference, and these are kids who are getting eco-literate in this tiny little town called Nha Trang there. We're teaching kids everywhere how to reconnect to soil because, in fact, soil, knowing how soil works, might be one of the most important vital signs in terms of seeing how healthy we are. And on the other end of the spectrum, these are medical students at University of Michigan who are learning how to farm, because this is the future of medicine as well, is understanding that the roots of our health are in our ecology and in our soil. Researchers are slowly starting to get on board. They're moving away from this mechanistic, algorithmic way of thinking to a much more complex way of thinking. And these are researchers at Yale who are starting to look at how farming can affect mental illness. These are researchers in Sweden, in Järna, who are farmers, who are posting the results of soil organic matter testing on the roadside next to their farm. And this is David Killalea, you're going to hear a lot more about him in the coming years, but he's an up-and-coming researcher at Corey Institute who's really looking at the connections between soil, varietal of plant, farming system, and nutrient value. Businesses like your wonderful Briar Patch are getting on. And when you buy consumer packaged goods, don't just be convinced by the labels. Find out what kind of soil they were grown in. And finally, anchor institutions like healthcare are starting to care about this. Technology is as well, and I really encourage you to start to think about, what we hear from Elizabeth and Paul is that they're hardly using any equipment at all. They're just using intelligent tinkering. So that it no longer looks like this or like this, but this is Mark Shepard's farm. I love that. So as you get out there and are starting to do this work, I would hope that you talk to people in your community about how soil is connected to health. And if you need some help starting the conversation, I'm going to give you some helpful vocabulary, okay? Here's one piece of the vocabulary. Look at the cross-section of our skin and the cross-section of soil. Not only do they look the same, but in function, they really are the same because nature is thrifty and she just does the same kinds of things over and over again. Or look at a cross-section of our gut and a cross-section of soil. Or can you tell which one of these is the rhizosphere and which one of these is our kidney? The vascular system in our kidney? Or on a microscopic level, can you tell which one of these is the roots of plants interacting with the microbes in the soil, or the villi of our intestine interacting with the microbes in our gut? No, you can't, because in fact, we are soil. Thank you so much.
Interesting, all your studies and stuff. All right, we are going to break for lunch, but before we do, let me mention that Daphne will be signing her book. She has 2 books here down at the book booth, which when you're facing the stage in the main hall is on the left. And if you're getting a lunch, you're gonna go down the hallway here, like when you get out, go past the main room. There'll be people there. Last year, we went through the lunch line really quickly. We were real happy with it, so I think that'll happen again. If you brought water bottles, there's water on the way. Don't forget to go get your passport stamped as you go to the different booths. See you in an hour.